This is part one of working with students who have a speech language impairment, which is also known more commonly as communication disorders. And we have several goals for the next couple of presentations to identify some common types of language and speech disorders, to define expressive and receptive language, to define words like semantics, pragmatics, morphology, phonology, and syntax, to identify and classify assistive technology, and to describe some ways to teach students with these disorders and to enhance students' social skills. First, language. Language is actually something that's a little bit hard to define, but some key elements of it is that language consists of the ability to communicate using symbols, and those symbols could be oral or written. So, in a sense, spoken language symbolizes the things we're talking about. So the word dog symbolizes a domesticated canine with, typically with four legs and a tail. So we can think of language as dog or, hund in Swedish or perro, perro in Spanish. But those are all symbols, whether it's the written symbol, which is more common to think of as symbol, but it's also the word itself sort of symbolizes the thing. So language is both oral and written. And language involves the expression and reception of ideas. Language does not require speech, it is separate from speech. That's why, for example, ASL, which we talked about people who are deaf and hard of hearing, is a language. Speech is how thoughts are expressed orally. A language disorder is an inability, excuse me, an inability to use the symbols of language through an inability to understand the proper use of words and their meanings, or appropriate use of grammatical patterns, or proper use of speech sounds. So there is some overlap between a language disorder potentially and a speech disorder. That's why they are sort of classified together as communication disorders. A speech disorder consists of difficulty in producing speech sounds, that is called articulation, maintaining speech rhythm, in other words, having fluent speech, and or controlling vocal production, controlling the sounds coming out of our mouths. There are two types of language you should be aware of, and here we're talking about them in terms of a disorder, but this is true for language just in general. Receptive language means receiving or understanding information. So listening and reading are both examples of receptive language. A person who has a receptive language disorder has difficulty in either receiving or understanding information. Expressive language is formulating, coming up with, and expressing, sharing ideas and information. We use expressive language when we write and when we speak. So if a person has difficulty formulating and sharing ideas and information in spoken or written language, that person has an expressive, may have, I should say, may have, that person may have an expressive language disorder. These issues do have associations with some other exceptionalities. So they have some associations with various physical exceptionalities. People who have cleft palates or cleft lips often have particularly speech disorders. And as we mentioned when we talked about deaf and hard of hearing individuals, hearing loss is also often associated with speech issues, particularly when the hearing loss is prelingual, in other words, before a person has learned language. This is a very common exceptionality. 19% of people receiving special ed services in schools are there because of this. And this doesn't count when this goes along with another condition. In other words, a person could have a communication disorder and also have an emotional behavior disorder. A person could have a communication disorder and also have um, and other health impairment like ADHD. And yes, a person could have a communication disorder and also a learning disability. In any of those cases, that other exceptionality is always going to be classified as the primary exceptionality, and that has to do largely for funding reasons. But communication disorders are always secondary if anything else is present. And so that means far more than 19% of individuals in school in special ed actually have communication disorders. But what we mean is that 19% have it as their only exceptionality. That is the second most common exceptionality behind only learning disabilities. Next, a little vocabulary for you related to language. So, phonology, we talked about some of this a little bit when we talked about reading disabilities. Phonology represents the idea of the relationship between sounds and symbols. Morphology, excuse me, represents ideas of word structures. So, that could be like prefixes and suffixes, for example. In English, we typically add ed on the end of a word to indicate that word is past tense. That is an example of a word structure. Um, Putting the prefix un in the front of a word to mean not, that's an example of a word structure. Making a word plural by adding s, or by, in a rare cases, changing to a different ending. Those are all examples of word structures. Those are morphological issues. Syntax, the simple definition of syntax that we're going to work with is that syntax means word order. Some more vocabulary: semantics. Semantics refers to meaning. Semantics is a person understands the meaning of what's expressed. And just like language, semantics can be receptive or expressive. We tend to have larger receptive vocabularies in our native languages than we do expressive vocabularies. In other words, we understand before we express, right? Before we learn to talk, we still can understand. We learn to understand what people around us are saying. Um, One example of this meaning and that it occurs in early childhood is the idea of overextension or overgeneralization. And so a 2 or a 3 year old, as they're learning language, might use, for example, the word dog to refer to any animal, or maybe to refer to any four-legged furry animal. My dad used to love telling the story of when I was 3. I got very excited as we were on a trip somewhere, and I looked out the window and I said, "Look, Dad, look at all the dogs." And in fact, we were driving by a herd of cows, a herd of cattle, and so he loved telling that story. Um, that is actually very typical. I was not unusual in that regard. Pragmatics refers to communication in context. In other words, this is the social use of language. It also includes nonverbal aspects of language, so body language, potentially tone of voice, how close you speak to somebody else. All those are pragmatical issues. As we move into some specific types of speech and language disorders, I want to remind you that we work with culturally diverse students. And difference, diversity, does not equal disorder. Dialects, we all have our own dialect of a language. We all speak our own dialect of English, right? Most people in this class speak a version of U.S. English, and so there are dialects associated with the Upper Midwest, like Minnesota, that are different from the dialects found in, say, Southern California, or in New York, or in Boston, or in Louisiana, or in the South in general, or in the West in general. There are also dialects that are related to culture, including to ethnicity. So there are certain speech patterns that are and grammar usage that are associated with, say, African American vernacular English, sometimes called Black English, that are associated sometimes with forms called Native American English. Um, as well as many other forms. There are many, many, many dialects of English around the world. And even within countries, there are many dialects. So we talk about US English versus British English or Australian English, but within the US, there are many dialects. Those dialects are not disorders. Differences are not disorders. Diversity, not disorders. When should you refer a child for special education services for communication issues? This is something that is most applicable in elementary. Lots of issues in special ed might not show up right away. I referred students for special ed at times when I taught middle school and even high school for a few things. But speech issues tend to come early. Here's when you would consider referring. If the child's speech is having difficulty communicating, is if the child's speech is causing the child to have difficulty communicating both with you as well as with their peers. That could include interactions in class, it could include educational performance, and it includes simply being very hard to understand and making sure it is not simply a dialect issue. And we'll talk about how referral works and later on in the course. As an example of this, and this was a student who was in speech, and she did need it, but she was exited as a fifth grader. This was my first year teaching, and I had a student whose name was Tara, and Tara had challenging speech to understand. You could understand it, but you had to stop and listen, and it took a while for you to get used to it. And the speech teacher at that school came to me and said, I think we're going to exit Tara. What do you think? We're not going to receive services anymore. And she said, I think we've done everything we can do. And I said, I can understand that. Like, she's understandable once you are used to it. It can be challenging. And then she said, you know why she talks that way? And I said, well, no, why? Why? Well, it turns out that Tara had a really unique background in that both of her older brothers had, I believe they had cerebral palsy. And cerebral palsy can cause speech issues because of how it affects the muscles in the throat and other areas of the body. And so um, she grew up imitating her brothers. Like, we learn to speak partially from the people around us, right? That's how we learn language and how we learn our dialects. Additionally, Tara was a Black American, and so she also had a Black American dialect, as well as a dialect that was affected by listening to her brothers who had speech issues caused by medical conditions. And so those combined to cause some, particularly in early elementary, before I knew her, for Tara to have communication issues with her peers and with adults. Um, if it were just an issue of Black English, if it were just an issue of Southern English, or just an issue of the Boston dialect, those are not reasons to refer. But when the issues emerge that there are communication challenges with peers as well as with adults, that's when referral might be appropriate to get the student extra help. This is a good place for us to leave off for this first part. We'll come back and we'll take a look at some language disorders in part two. Thanks for watching.